you. Thank you.
Yay.
Maybe before the acknowledgement, do you mind if I kind of do a little bit of a quick blessing, just for folks?
Yes.
All right. So real quick, okay. Bless all your brains, bless all your minds, right? For great thinking, for doing great work, and take care of all of us, right? Let's hope for a good session. Get all the folks to really think about what they're doing in this world today, right? This is Earth Day, it's 50th anniversary, right? A lot of good intention, a lot of good vibes, right? This is a season of hope. It's a season of remembrance. It's a season of inspiring people to do great things that they're supposed to be doing, and know that everyone is strong and powerful and beautiful, and that we got this all together, and we'll face this challenge together. And so I want to bless everyone up, right? So strong minds, strong arms, strong backs, strong legs, strong hearts. All right.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Right, gotcha.
Hello, everybody. I see lots of people coming in still. I wanted to thank you for joining in and taking the time. I'm going to welcome all the panelists to activate their cameras so that they can together help me welcome you into this space and join us, in this difficult time. Thank you for taking the time and the space in your calendar, the emotional space, right, to make room for, a conversation, an important conversation in this difficult time. And in remembrance, joining in reflection, right, in remembrance of Earth Day. Such an important moment. 50 years ago, thousands of people, right, gathered to dare to dream and to dare to envision a brighter future. And here we are 50 years later doing the same, imagining and daring to envision a brighter future for 50 years from now, right? So we are not in a moment of celebration as we're sharing a crisis. It has always been about crisis. Earth Day was never a celebration. It is a movement. Yes, it is a movement of reformers, of people seeking change and seeking a brighter future. And why is it so important to seize this moment, in a time of crisis, in a time of crisis, because inequalities and because realities become, are so unbearable, we have no choice, no real choice, but to envision something new. So I'll welcome you into this space with an inspirational quote from Arundhati Roy. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, or avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, or dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through it lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So thanks for joining us in this moment of vision. I'll pass here to Audrey.
So hi everyone, my name's Audrey Waite. I'm a senior undergraduate at Cal State Fullerton. I'm pursuing a degree in geography and food studies. So I want to thank you all for joining us today, sharing this space with us, this virtual space, and really just participating in such a critical conversation. Before we move forward, we want to acknowledge the fact that this land is originally known as Hutonga and Totanga. It is the ancestral homeland and traditional territory of the Tongva, the Hashimen, and the Poyam-Coachim nations, the original people of this land and their descendants. We believe indigenous people are the real champions of the environmental movement, the ones who knew sustainability before it was called sustainability, and the stewards of this land. We stand in solidarity with our Native brothers and sisters. More so, we recognize that land acknowledgement is the bare minimum. We commit ourselves indefinitely to respecting and reconciling this long history of injustice. Thank you.
And I just want to chime in. One way that we can do that is to become aware and support the land protectors of one of the sacred sites that was mentioned. That is on the Cal State Long Beach property. Those protectors have been in a battle with the university for decades. And so we just want to call our attention and support that particular movement that's happening right now. And if folks want more information, we can put that up when we post the video. Thank you.
Happy Earth Day, everyone. My name is Jose Trinidad Castaneda, and I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping webinar rules for all of us as we move forward. We've set all your settings to mute, so your camera and your microphone will be off for the duration of the webinar. And our panelist discussion will be approximately 1 hour, followed by question and answer at the end. So we encourage all of you to submit your questions on our Q&A feature. This event is being recorded and will be made available after it is finished. So keep an eye out for an email with the email that you provided us. And we look forward to engaging with you all and continuing a mighty discussion that is sorely needed at this time. So thank you.
So I invite Moises and Ruben to introduce, and Amber.
Okay, I guess I'll start off. So my name is Moises Plasencia, and I'm a lecturer of anthropology, right? And my focus is urban agriculture and paleo-ethnobotany.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ruben Lopez, professor of geography at Fullerton College. I'm a physical geographer, and I focus on the interaction between the natural world and the human world.
And hi, everybody. I'm Amber Gonzalez, professor and chair of ethnic studies at Fullerton College. And my areas of focus are women of color feminisms, indigenous studies, and cultural production.
And I realize I never introduced myself. I am Aline Gregorio, professor of geography. Once again, thanks for being here. I will go ahead and introduce us or transition us into the topics of conversation. We will be having a pretty dense conversation, so be ready for some dense statements around 6 topics: resilient economies, environmental systems and human health, just food systems, food sovereignty, divestment and policy, and all of these themes, surround social justice, equity, and sustainability in general. So I'll go ahead and start, for us to take a moment to begin this conversation with our conversation about the economy, okay? So as we face the biggest economic downturn in our history, and we begin to think about a way forward, let's come to an important realization. Let's acknowledge the fact that this is a lethal economy, okay? That status quo claims millions of lives around the world each year. And for example, I'll take just the example of air. Yes, a vital resource. In the United States alone, this economy kills 100,000 Americans by air each year. When we think of it globally, that number is more than 5 million. When we think of pollution in general, estimates go as high as 9 million people per year in the world, right? Now, that is a really large fatality, and I don't state this to, in any way minimize the current global pandemic. I just want to highlight the fact that this pandemic is spreading across the world atop existing crises and pre-existing conditions, right? Why has it not been deemed a crisis? Why has pollution not been deemed a crisis? Certainly, pollution has improved in some places around the world, and historically, when we look back 50 years ago and what the environmental movement achieved with pollution, right? We have been able to reduce pollution, but if 9 million people are still dying from pollution, and we're not deeming it a crisis, why not? Okay. Largely because pollution is locked in geographies of oppression. not contagious by touch, but contagious by environment. Environments inhabited by the most oppressed among us, right? Overwhelmingly, the global poor, indigenous communities, people of color, yes. And, you know, and for that reason, it's just sort of this false perception, you know, that is not a shared crisis, right? I mean, it isn't shared equally, certainly, and definitely overwhelmingly by the oppressed. So we must come to that realization as we go forward, that moving forward as status quo means to move forward with an economy that kills millions of people around the world. So, you know, how to resolve this? Well, that's a big question. There are two realizations, two things that I want to highlight today with you as we think of our way forward. The first one is that globalization must change. This economy must change. And in that, we've known that it must change in the sense of aligning economic activity to principles of human rights and environmental sustainability. But also, I think what has really been highlighted is that it must change in the sense that we need to be more resilient. Economies are not resilient as they are. Take, for example, you know, the wealthiest nation on earth ran out of a 75-cent mask, right? And that is because it is an economy that is not prepared for the shock of scarcity of essential goods like medical protective gear, right? And there are other essential goods that were not prepared for the shock of scarcity, like, you know, fossil fuels, for example. So in that, you know, self-sufficiency, we will need to rethink globalization. We need to rethink what must globalize on what terms, right? And what do we do when it comes to essential goods? We need to start plugging in self-sufficiency in that equation. That is not to say that, you know, the way forward is an isolated world or an isolated economy. This crisis will certainly be used to justify walls, to justify travel bans, to justify economic disconnect, yes. And historically, we have known that that is no way forward, that globalization brings a lot of assets that benefit humanity. Globalization has lifted 1 billion people out of poverty in the last 20 years. It hasn't done so equitably, and that needs to change too. But what is the biggest asset, right, from global cooperation? I'm gonna, you know, evoke the thoughts of Yuval Harari. He's a famous historian. And one of the things that he said that stuck with me is that our way forward, our antidote is global cooperation. Global cooperation in science, right? Having global scientists collaborate on a single topic, right? And global cooperation that, you know, enables and diffuses ideals of free press. Having press that can hold our governments accountable, right? Transparency in the media, freedom of press is important. And, you know, less than 20% of the world's population enjoy it. So America first cannot be America alone. America alone is not America first, right? Because America alone does not benefit from the assets of partnerships, collaboration in science, and science-based policies. Lastly, when we think about, you know, the economy forward, we really must value and put front and center our most valuable economic assets. Number one is human beings. There is no economy without human beings. Human beings are vital resources, and not in the way that you consume and dispose, in a way in which vital resources are lifelines, right? So think about the human beings in our communities, the medical workers, the farmers, the grocers, the, you know, the deliveries, all of these human beings acting as lifelines for every single one of us. Those human beings need to be cherished, preserved, And that's why we need to support safety nets for human beings. And that's how we can move forward in a better light. And lastly, in moving forward, the second most valuable resource is nature's regenerative systems. It turns out the earth will move on without us. You know, the earth will endure. If you've been following the maps, right, showing the skies are becoming clearer in the world's major cities, pollutants are going down, wildlife is reclaiming space, right? And it turns out earth will endure, it regenerates, it heals, and we can make the choice of being part of that process. Is not an elusive idea. It is a way, an economy, a resilient, sustainable economy can be observed in indigenous cultures, right? A practice that predates all of our academic literature on circular economies or sustainability. That wisdom is present for us to capitalize on. So those are the two visions I leave you with on that.
Alini, can I jump in and ask a question and engage? So I really like this idea of global cooperation, partnerships, and collaboration. Are there any examples that you've been following or that you might be able to share with us? Like, what could that look like? Or is this just merely a vision? I would imagine that there are folks already engaging in this type of work.
Well, you know, we have a framework that acts as global cooperation frameworks, right? Institutional or institutionalized financial organizations, right? Like the World Bank and the IMF will have historically not been in the best interest of the developing world. But in this particular case, like the World Health Organization is meant to be an organization for global cooperation, you know, and now that the wealthiest nation on earth decides not to pitch in to this organization, let me tell you this much, you know, when diseases and pandemics hit the poor world, the developing world, there is no privilege of social distancing, right? Poor nations rely on the World Health Organization, rely on medical assistance. And, you know, that institutional framework exists and can be used. You know, there's a lot of problems with it. I'm not saying that there isn't, but that's how we collaborate, is by having these transnational, you know, organizations.
I was gonna ask, do you mind expanding and maybe like defining what a circular economy is?
Good. So a circular economy is economic activity that operates within Earth's regenerative systems, right? So this idea of infinite growth in a finite planet is, you know, unrealistic, right? So it is an economy that is focused on reusing. It is focusing on building, you know, not new, right? It's not like a new, infinite new production. It's renewable resources. Everything is within regeneration. You know, it really tackles the idea of disposing. Yeah. So maybe we can move forward with the next topic here, you know, as we think about all of these problems, and certainly environmental systems have a lot to do, you know, is the underlying economy is the environmental system. So I'm going to pass the environmental systems to Ruben here to talk a little bit about that and disease.
I'm going to be speaking a little bit more related to how we got to this point in terms of the environment, the natural world, and what our society has done to sort of promote the movement of this particular virus, right, into the human space. And I say that in the sense that as a geographer, right, we are pretty good at looking at the big picture and finding patterns, not only in the natural world, but in the human world in terms of behavior. And one of the things that I was interested in looking into, is this terminology being used to describe this pandemic as a natural disaster? And one of the things that I talk about in my intro classes, my intro physical geography classes, with my students is that there is no such thing as a natural disaster. Let me clarify that a little bit. It is, but I would say that term is misused. It's used far too often to describe things. And the misuse of that term actually is a detriment to the ability of humanity to adjust to what is happening in the natural world, right? By calling everything a natural disaster, it takes the onus of responsibility off of our shoulders completely. And if you look at something like climate change, for example, specifically anthropogenic climate change, that is not a natural disaster. That is human-caused disaster in this case. And in my classes, I share an article by a philosopher named Thomas Wells, who in 2017 wrote the discrepancy, or the disparity, I should say, between natural and human disaster. And so with these two working definitions, I'd like you to put that in the context of this COVID-19 pandemic, right? So a natural disaster, according to philosopher Thomas Wells, natural disasters are supposed to have been caused entirely by forces outside of human control. They were inevitable, right? No one can be held responsible. Now compare that to what he defines as a human-made disaster. These are disasters that are acknowledged to have been brought about by human decisions. These disasters could have been avoided if certain people or institutions, or I should say or institutions, had made different choices. And that is exactly where COVID-19 falls under. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about those conspiracy theories saying that COVID-19 was formed in a bioweapons lab in Wuhan, China, or that 5G towers are causing the spread of COVID-19. I'm talking about how viruses move between the natural world into the human world, and how our actions have facilitated that movement into our sphere of influence, right? This pandemic then classifies as a human-made disaster. And then so are the other impacts of anthropogenic climate change. So keep that in mind as we move forward. I am referring to this as a human-caused disaster. And specifically, I'm going to look at climate change and deforestation as two impacts that the human world has had on the natural world, and how that has now reciprocated on us, right? And this is not the first time. In fact, epidemiologists and virologists have been warning society about the movement of viruses in these global pandemics for decades now. In fact, in 2012, there was a book written on it, right, by David Quammen called Spillover. It was a New York Times best-selling book. So it's out there. I've got mine at Barnes & Noble. Please make sure you pick yours up. I didn't write it, so I don't get any kickback for saying that. But if you want to know some information on specifically detailed explanation of how viruses move between the natural world and the human world, that book is readily available to explain things. Now, scientists have been looking at this for quite a long time, because this is not the first time, and unfortunately, it won't be the last time that we are faced with the global pandemic. Specifically, let's look at biodiversity loss. So ecosystems that are disrupted tend to lose their biggest predators first, right? And what they leave behind then are these smaller animals like rats that tend to live fast, reproduce in large numbers, have immune systems that may be more robust, that can withstand some of the impacts of these bacteria and viruses that are in the biosphere there. And while all of these predators are dying off, these smaller animals are becoming vectors for more and more and more viruses, right? As these species die off then, these viruses become concentrated in these smaller animals. According to a 2010 study, degraded habitats harbor more of the viruses that can infect humans, right? Biodiversity loss, which is what we're talking about, amplifies viral infections in these remaining species, right? There's fewer hosts, so the animals that exist have more and more of these viruses built up in them. A 2020 study, I believe it was published in March of this year, showed that almost half of new diseases that jumped from animals to humans, these are called zoonotic viruses, right, after 1940 can be traced to changes in land use, including agriculture and wildlife hunting, right? And if you look at other viruses beside this version of SARS, you look at SARS-1 from 2003, you look at Ebola, you look at West Nile virus, you look at Lyme disease, you look at Middle East respiratory syndrome, MERS, right? All of these are zoonotic viruses that have jumped then in large part due to habitat loss and biodiversity loss related to that. Now, specifically to climate change, let's focus on that one first. There is no direct evidence at this point that climate change has caused this particular pandemic, but generally speaking, climate change may shift habitats and bring wildlife, crops, livestock, and humans into close contact with these pathogens, with these viruses that are out there. And as these movements of organisms are maintaining their dynamic movement in this case and cross-contamination, if you will, they may come in contact, animals like ourselves may come in contact with viruses we have no immunity for, right? And so climate change can do this in a couple of different ways. Number one, many of us focus on vectors, right? Vectors like mosquitoes to spread diseases. Those of us living in Southern California, especially today, are very well familiar with West Nile virus. In our particular community in Fullerton, where I teach, last couple of years or so, the city had to spray chemicals over communities to try to kill those mosquitoes to try to control the spread of West Nile virus, right? These tropical diseases, right, like malaria, for example, the #1 killer of humanity all time, right? They are found in, or spread, I should say, through the movement of mosquitoes. These tropical mosquitoes, like the Aedes aegypti mosquito, are expanding their range as climate change traps, anthropogenic climate change, I should say, allows more heat to exist close to the surface of the earth. That spreads the tropic zones toward the poles, moving these mosquitoes into areas where they haven't been able to maintain sustainable populations prior to this. Now they are. And as humans living in a non-tropical region, we don't have, #1, the infrastructure. We definitely don't have the immunity to these new diseases coming our way, right? So that's just one way. Another way, however, though, is that climate change is helping to move entire ecosystems out of where they are today. So, for example, a study was brought up last year where in a couple of decades, San Francisco will have the same climate as LA does today, right? And that includes the biosphere changing in San Francisco to exhibit something more familiar to what LA looks like today, again, as climate shifts. Now that also means that animals are going to move to those new locations and carry those viruses with them, right? Animals that may have viruses living in LA today move up to San Francisco where they come in contact with other animals that may not have those viruses. And now you have new hosts for those viruses to exist. Climate change may cause things like drought. In areas where crops are drying up, perhaps hunting becomes more of a pathway to gain food. That directly puts humans in contact with animals, which could spread diseases to those humans, and those humans bring that infected animal back to their place of living. That now spreads into the human world. So it's not just a question of climate change directly impacting, particularly with heat, the movement of viruses. It's much more subtle than that. And that's something that's lost, I think, on many outside of the scientific community. In terms of deforestation then, right, related in some ways to climate change, but particular to land use in this case, and I'll finish up with this. Deforestation, particularly in areas where we are seeing a massive degradation of the natural world, areas, for example, in the news recently, like the Amazon basin. According to a 2005 study, croplands and pastures are one of the largest terrestrial biomes now on the planet, occupying roughly 40 to 50% of land surface, right? This means that agricultural production is the single most extensive form of land use today, right? In the tropics, new agricultural land has come at the expense of rainforests, savanna, other ecosystems, and obviously then future expansion will clear even more of these pristine forests and other ecosystems. And according to the Union of Concerned Scientists in 2016, 3 of the 4 factors most responsible for deforestation are related to Western food systems. You're looking at things like beef production, soy production, palm oil production. And again, as we limit the biosphere, as we promote the loss of biodiversity in this case, it makes it more available for these viruses then to jump hosts from animal to human, right? And a couple of takeaways, right? I have 2 takeaways here before I end. Number 1, our collective actions over time have brought about optimal conditions for quote unquote spillover from animal to human. And we could continue to cause future pandemics with our current actions. But the second takeaway, since we are talking about a hope for the future, is this: because humanity has played a role in bringing about these optimal conditions, we also have the power within ourselves to provide solutions to the problem. This is not necessarily a natural world issue. This is a human action issue impacting the natural world. And because of that, that also means that we have the power to change our course. And I'll end there, and my colleagues will address just a couple of ways that we can help along in this process. Thank you.
Can I chime in just real quick? Because I really want to make the connection of what Ruben is talking about with the toxic way that globalization operates, right? The great disconnect in our global connectivity, the disconnect from the African child's hands harvesting the cacao and the cobalt, right? The disconnect from the beef and the Amazon, right? And the minerals, and the fact that indigenous people are being invaded for those things to take place. We know that recently the first uncontacted isolated tribe Amazonian person died of COVID-19, but that, you know, this year and last year, dozens more were murdered for those resources, right? So the toxic way in which globalization operates, in which the wildlife trade, you know, it's where all of this started, right? COVID-19 started in a wildlife domestic animal market. So it's interesting how that draws back to that toxic economy that really needs to be rethought.
Quick question, just for Ruben. So a big issue with COVID-19 is the connection to wet markets and specifically bushmeat, right? Have there been any attempts to try to raise bushmeat or any type of animals that are connected to wet markets, or try to strong actions to try to deter the consumption of some of these species? I think the current science is backing that there is a connection between the pangolin, right, which is like an armadillo anteater, right, type of creature, and bats, right? Now, have there been any ways to try to sustainably harvest these? I mean, it seems like as a food anthropologist, it seems hard to try to change and shift people's cultural cuisine, right? Now, has been any kind of shift, you know, of folks changing or their modes of getting these food items to do it in a more sustainable way?
Sorry, a couple of technical difficulties there. Thank you for that question. And the truth is, I don't know of any, it's sort of outside my realm of expertise, that particular question, but in my readings, as we've moved through this pandemic here, virologists, epidemiologists have not confirmed that the Wuhan wet market was the source of the pandemic. The best they know right now, from my readings on this, is that it did come from a bat, but in terms of an intermediary animal like a pangolin, right, they're not 100% sure yet. They're not confirming that as the actual vector in this case for the jumping point between the animal world and the human world. Now, that being said, I'm also not comfortable focusing specifically on a cultural practice that, while many of us may find it somewhat offensive, I don't want to point at the finger at China without looking at the United States. Many people don't realize, and as part of the perhaps discussion, or as perhaps some of the resources we provide afterwards for our audience, in 2015, the Obama administration did try to curb the traffic of these foreign animals into the United States. And the New York Times reported at that time that we are one of the largest traffickers of these animals. So this pandemic can happen here. If you look at how we process meat in the United States, it might not be a wet market, but if you guys have ever read Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, right? This is an ongoing problem. This is not focused on China's and focused on the wet markets in some parts of the world. I believe it's commonly understood that once we put ourselves in contact with an animal, and especially in the slaughter of animals, and if we're not careful, even in a situation where we like to think it's controlled, like in a Western meat processing plant, right? That is, I would say, not always the case, and it's definitely not reported probably as often as it should be. We know that, for example, pathogens, viruses do travel, do pass along, and even in a controlled environment as possible, we're never perfect, and there's always room for some of these things to jump through and infect us as a population. So I'll leave that there. Like I said, I just don't, I think it's disingenuous to point the finger solely at China and cultural practices when we have a lot of looking in the mirror to do ourselves.
Which I think is an excellent segue into what I'm going to be talking about, because I'm going to kind of echo a bit of what you said about zoonotic diseases, and sort of extend more on the US and our meat processing facilities. So sort of as an extension of Ruben and Alini's talk, I think the point to reiterate here is that all lives and all species coexist. So really, there's no such thing as a linear existence, as we are continuously reminded of. We are ultimately all connected in the web of life, and this is just as present in the realm of globalization and the economy as it is in ecology and the natural world. We're not separate from other species, and we are certainly not separate from each other. So I think our judgment and our ability to not only understand, but feel interwoven has drastically lessened over time. Living in a capitalist society has clouded our intuitive knowledge to empathize and engage in a deeper understanding of the systems in place. So this is reflected in the way that we treat the land and we treat people and other species. Generally speaking, consumerism is faintly tied to a value-based system, which brings me to the point that under the motive of profit, industrialized agriculture is thriving upon the exploitation of the land and our people and other species. This is especially highlighted during a time of crisis, where we see that our food is more political now than it has ever been. From farm to table, there is a lineage of issues that we've been asked to ignore, to neglect and see as an inevitable fate, a necessary evil, a means to sustain the whole. This pandemic, I think, is actively teaching us a lesson. We are currently witnessing the global spread of what could be yet another zoonotic disease, as Ruben had mentioned, and it's, in my opinion, a consequence of humanity's enslavement and consumption of other animals. Animals are jam-packed in facilities where they are slaughtered by the masses in inhumane and unsanitary conditions for human consumption. This industry is huge, so much so that it is strongly embedded in the US economy, which sort of brings in the question of what Alini was alluding to earlier, what exactly defines a resilient economy? At this rate, livestock accounts for 0.1% of the world's total biomass, surpassing wild animals, which only account for 0.007. Today, there are more domesticated birds than there are wild. And in the realm of environmental sustainability, once again, animal ag is the #1 cause of greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, freshwater usage, and deforestation. This is a colonial interpretation of a food system. Meanwhile, the CDC, again echoing what Ruben said, says that over 60% of zoonotic diseases are capable of spreading from animals to humans, and 3 out of every 4 new or emerging infectious diseases do come from animals. Factory farming is the #1 reason for the rapid spread of bird and swine flu, for example. In 2015, the US lost $3.3 billion due to the US bird flu outbreak. With the increasing demand for animal consumption, this might very much be the new normal. Meat packing facilities in specific are hot spots for infectious diseases, opening a portal to very lethal consequences. And who is most exposed? Low-income migrant people of color working these facilities. Migrant labor in particular has proven time and time again to be essential to sustaining our population. The USDA states that 4% of US farm workers are immigrants with US citizenship, 21% are under other authorization, and the remaining 48% are undocumented, most of them being in California. Yet, given that they are so embedded in the industry, so embedded in the US economy, they are still treated as disposable. This is increasingly apparent during today's pandemic, specifically in the meat industry. In South Dakota, 293 of the 730 people who were diagnosed with COVID-19 came from one single meat packing facility. For Smithfield Foods, that's the name of the company. Although the plant was closed, the Smithfield president and CEO, Kenneth Sullivan, said in a statement, "We produce food, we believe it's our obligation to help feed the country now more than ever. We have a stark choice as a nation. We are either going to produce food or not, even in the face of COVID-19. Similarly, at a Tyson plant in Camilla, Georgia, the company offered workers a little $500 bonus if they worked in April, May, and June without missing a day. A meatpacking plant in Colorado had dozens of their workers infected with coronavirus, so much so that it led to a shutdown. Again, this is begging the question if these industries are necessarily stable. These systems interlock the oppression of human animals and non-human animals in the name of profit. Again, this is a colonial interpretation of a sustainable industry. All this to say that most of us are at a state where we are conditioned, if not encouraged, to feel removed from crises, environmental and social. Capitalism thrives off an apathetic society. We are wanted as consumers and consumers alone. But let us not lose sight of the moments where we are reminded of how tightly woven we are. As Wendell Berry brilliantly states, the earth is what we all have in common. In light of hope, we must remember that as much as we are binded by these oppressions, we are more binded by light and love. Today's conditions are a consequence of the real infections, in my opinion, and that's capitalism, colonization, and greed. Nevertheless, there is room to uncondition ourselves and move forward towards a more intuitive and grounded reality. One where workers are no longer funneled into industries like meatpacking facilities. One where they are no longer expected to work through a global pandemic, coming with the potential of coming in contact with human beings and other animals alike that are infectious. One where we know where our food comes from, where we reclaim our ancestral ways and learn to connect with the soil on our own terms. I like to believe that there is infinite possibility towards growth and sovereignty, food sovereignty in specific, which Moises will touch on shortly. This conversation, I think, has surpassed the points of just talking about conservation or as an activist just opting out of these systems. I think there's more to that, and it's about planting your own seeds, establishing community, and holding injustices accountable. There's no liberation in a neoliberal food system, and really our old normal wasn't normal. It was oppressive and neglectful towards human animals and non-human animals alike. We should be actively trying to shift that version of normal, and I believe the most radical thing that you can do is empathize. So I encourage you all to do so. Thank you.
That was so beautiful. I'm catching my breath.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Audrey, just you did so wonderful. I just wanted to follow up and add a comment that you're absolutely correct, that when these industries funnel workers into meat packing and slaughterhouse facilities, we sometimes forget that these are our own family members, and it hits close to home because I have a cousin who immigrated from Mexico to work in a slaughterhouse in Idaho, and unfortunately lost one of his limbs. So now he's disabled on top of that. And so there's multiple intersections that follow from that. But thank you for bringing that up.
Right, and I think that that's kind of the point that I was trying to make, that they see these human beings as disposable. I mean, given the conditions that they're in and the expectations that are, I mean, at the minimum inhumane, I think that it's definitely a very unempathetic way of running a food system.
Yeah, and kind of to comment, like to maintain self-respect and dignity within the work and the labor force is seems to be very trying in this model of food production. And I really appreciate you commenting on the issues with our meat packing, especially, you know, in our meat industry, because it's really a big issue.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's a good way to segue into your talk.
Should I go? Okay, all right, folks, let's get into it. Okay, so welcome. Okay, so I appreciate it. Happy Earth Day, everyone. 2020, 50 years, right? So on this day, I always think about this really special connection that we gets highlighted, and that is our connection to ecology, connection to the earth, right? And I love this quote by Naomi Klein from her book, This Changes Everything. It says, "Just because biology is full of generosity does not mean its forgiveness is limitless." Meaning that our ecosystem has a breaking point, right? And we have honestly lived, we should be very appreciative of what we've been able to do on this planet so far, right? And I think the way to do that is to really recognize where we're at now. To really connect this idea of food, right? We're thinking about, okay, what is going on currently that's making us all really think about food, right? And that is, of course, the COVID virus, right? This COVID-19 virus, which is making us all homebound, right? Now, while people are panic buying and they're focused on where food ends with overbuying toilet paper, they're not thinking about where food begins, right? Meaning that they're not really thinking about the origins of it, how it's grown. And I want to take you on a little journey real quick and talk about some of the instabilities that have been pronounced because of this current crisis. And one of them is just to kind of ask a rhetorical question. How many of you have gone to a store recently in the past 2 weeks and have looked for something, an item, and have not been able to find it? Right? And if that has been the case, think about this is why, right? There's some instabilities in our supply chains, right? Now, the global food supply chain and transportation challenges are pronounced, right? And it gets even crazier because from Florida to California, what we're seeing happening is vegetable farms, right? And also meat packing farms, the meat industry is having to, and even the milk industry is having to throw it away, right? Literally goes straight to a landfill or just is allowed to rot on the vine. Right now, this is happening in a moment when we are experiencing food pantries, food banks, right? These soup kitchens that are donating food to the public, and they are unable to meet the quotas or meet these lines, right? And we have miles and miles of people waiting just to receive some food donations, right? So this is highlighting the economic interest versus the social equity justice issues that are in our food system, right? And but in light of that, right, there are folks who are working to try to bring hope, right? So we have organizations like Replate, which is in the Bay Area of California, which is working with groceries and restaurants that is repurposing, rescuing food from the landfills, right? And they're taking it and they're giving it to organizations that work on food insecurity and neighborhoods that need it. Right. Now, that being said, this is not one of the first times that we faced a global pandemic, right? One of the most important pandemics that is usually understated is a smallpox pandemic that wiped out 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas, right? Now, to think about what happened during that period of time, right? This was a cultural devastation. This was a traditional devastation. The systems collapsed, right, under the because of this virus. But what ended up resulting, right, was what we do have that still exists are their food growing techniques and also their seeds, right? So we have chinampas, right, which is a sustainable form of agriculture that is still in practice today, right, that at one point fed 500,000 people in the Tenochtitlan, present day Mexico City, right? And this is still alive, right? And then we also have seeds, right? Now to think about seeds, they're beautiful. I'm a seed lover, a plant lover, people lover. Right now, to think about this, domestication took a long time, right? It took a really long time, right? Meaning we had to find the right species out of millions of species that wasn't poisonous, that tastes good, that was versatile, that can make tamales and also cake. I love cake, right? And to think about this, and just to really, I'm not sure who exactly did, but to those who domesticated coffee, thank you from the bottom of my heart. You are God, right? Now, this is important stuff to think about because this process of domestication, which took thousands of years, answered a very important question, which is the omnivore's dilemma, our problem, right? Meaning, what are we going to eat, right? We might face that on a date night, right? But to think about this for a culture, for a species, for us, right? It is a really beautiful thing to think that our ancestors figured out what to eat, right? Paul Rosen describes this term in 1976 and says that this is part of our biological heritage, right? It's unique to our individuals' families, but it's also important to our culture and cuisine, right? Meaning that we communicate with food, right? We do things with food that isn't really done in any other way, right? Now, that being said, we live in an urban environment where sometimes our food is fed to us, is funneled to us because of industry that we talked about, the capitalism, the deforestation that we're not connected to, all this kind of stuff, right? Now, as of 1996, more than 50% of the population lives in an urban environment, right? And in the US, it's even crazier, right? We have 8 out of 10 people live in an urban environment. Now, why am I bringing that up? Because we are detached, we are disconnected from our food. Right now, I'm gonna take y'all back to 2009 when I first started doing some of this food work, right? And ask y'all a quick question that was asked to me by this aged Mayan man in the Yucatan Peninsula. And he says, "En su pueblo, ¿qué es lo que siembras?" Right? In your town, what do you grow? Right? So I'm gonna ask y'all that same question. In your town, what do you grow? Right? Now, if your answer is, I have no idea, right? Maybe some illicit thing, right? Then okay, right? But if you know, then awesome, right? Now, that question made me ponder something bigger, right? Meaning that what he was asking me is, what is your food shed, right? Now, what is a food shed, folks? It is defined as a geographically limited sphere of land, people, and businesses tied together by food relationships. Meaning, who are the people that bring you what you need to eat, right? And how are you connected to this, right? Now, I'll ask you that same question. What is your food shed, right? And if you don't know what it is, then you better ask somebody, right? You better ask somebody for sure. Right now, to think about these critical questions, right? We have 30%. Actually, now thank you for Ruben for that comment, because I did not know that it was actually 40% now, right? So 40% of the Earth's surface is used for cropland, right? And to think about this, we have 75 billion tons of fertilizer that are being used each year, right? And this is degrading our environment, meaning that there is a risk that 30% of the world's arable land will be unproductive. Right, will be unproductive because of the use of agrochemicals, right? And the agrochemicals that are used and also the petroleum that is being used is extremely critical, right? Because our entire food system relies on petroleum, right? And if you want to know about climate change, I'm pretty sure everyone does in this room, greenhouse gas emissions is the #1 threat for our species, right? And that is a critical thing to think about. All right, now, but on the bright side, what we do see is that organic farms are gaining in popularity. We have 4,000 organic farms in the US as of 2016, right? In California, you know, I love Cali, right? We have by far the largest amount of certified organic farms, 2,713, right? Now, but what Audrey would mention was the concentrated animal feeding operations, the big meat industry. Now, the meat industry is crazy. The source of zoonotic diseases, like Ruben had talked about, overuse of antibiotics, it's crazy, right? But on the bright side, right, we do actually have the people identifying more and more as vegans, right? So it grew from 1% to 6% from 2014 to 2017. That's a 600% increase, meaning that people are being more conscious, more understanding, more into the paradigm that we do not need to eat meat, right? And if you think about anyone's ancestors, right, if you ask your great-grandparents or just your grandparents how often they ate meat, I'm pretty sure it's not as much as we eat meat today, right? Now, and another tragedy is our food system, right? Our food waste is, as of right now, was 40%, right, of our food that is produced goes into a landfill. That being said, you know, just to really think about this idea of visions of hope, right? Cal Recycle, which is a California-run program, is currently funding locally local grants for composting programs and the amount of $1 million, right? So this is a recent development because at least we have regions that are understanding we have this need for things, right? Now, one of the even bigger tragedies is our agricultural workers, right? To think about this, there are more people in prison than there are farmers, right? But sometimes the people who are working the farms wish they were in prison because of how crappy it is, right? Meaning that it is very troubling for the farm workers to go, ah, damn, I didn't think I was getting emotional about it. And pick vegetables, and then have to have somebody who runs the company say that they their culture is the problem. That is not a solution, right? But in saying that, where there is these intense situations when it comes to work, there is always hope, right? So I always think about another group of large forced labor groups, which were people who were forced to be removed from Africa to work in America as slaves. Now they came over here, and when they came over here, they came with very little hope. But what they did have is their seeds. They would put them in their hair and braids, right? And they, if you ever wonder why there's so many rice dishes in the Caribbean, right? It's because they brought over rice seeds in their hair so they can grow them here in the States, right? And also okra, greens, plantains, black-eyed peas, pigeon peas, sesame seeds, a lot of things that are in gumbo, a lot of recipes that we find in Southern dishes today, right? Now, these are really important things to think about, right? And one of the scariest things that maybe we had to think the Green Revolution, which was a process of adding too many technologies to our agricultural system, is the elimination of biodiversity, right? 90% of all biodiversity in our ag system has gone, right? There's a concentration of corn, rice, and wheat and soy, right? And that's been highly available in our diets. Now, but on the other hand, my personal research, I have found things like this. I'm not sure if you can see this, maíz ajo. This is garlic corn, right? Species and varieties that I've been able to find grown in the backyards of people in urban areas, right? And they are actually helping decolonize our diet, decolonize what we're supposed to be eating. Meaning that they are offering authentic symbols that connect us to important things, right? And these seeds represent an important landscape, right? An important landscape to, a landscape to what we're experiencing. All right, now, that being said, we have people who are seed saviors, right? Seed saviors that are in all of our urban areas. They could be your aunts and uncles that are saving seeds, right? And we just don't have, we haven't identified them and given them value, right? And that's very important to think about, right? Now, this idea of food sovereignty, which concerns the involvement in and the protection of local food sources, knowledge, livelihoods, traditions, and the environment, is deeply tied to food security, meaning that our ability to maintain and keep our local varieties of things, to keep and maintain our traditional knowledge of cooking, of cuisine, is so important, right? And this knowledge and cuisine that we're keeping alive plays a critical role in how we're moving forward in the future, right? When we talk about visions of what we're experiencing. Right now, one important element could be that I want to talk about is just what's happening in North and South Dakota, right, with the Lakota people. Right now, these folks had experienced a genocide, right, and treaty after treaty, many treaties that have been broken. Right, what we see happening is they have, through this experience, faced assimilation, buffalo genocides, plant varieties have been destroyed, and they have been reliant on government cheeses, peanut butter, Indian tacos. If y'all ever heard of fry bread in Lakota Nation, fry bread is not native, right? It is a introduced species, introduced food item, right? And what we're seeing is there is a group called the North American Traditional Indigenous Food System, or NATIFs, right? Which is rekindling all Native peoples in their native food ways, right? And their goal is to connect with food identification, gathering and cultivation, Native traditions, and preparation, right? And in their group, one of the groups is called the Sioux Chef, no pun intended, but the Sioux Chef, right? And they are actually helping develop and maintaining food sovereignty with delicious menu items that we, if you are interested, I will definitely recommend you check them out, right? So I think my time is up. Right, so I want to just say thank you to everyone, and yeah.
Awesome, thank you, Moises. I have a quick question. So I've been thinking a lot about like how to participate, because I've really been thinking about that question, like where does food begin, right? Not just where it ends up, where it comes from. And so I've been thinking about, well, how can we define our food shed in urban areas? So I've been thinking about community supported agriculture, so CSA, and I just wanted to know like what your thoughts were on that, because I feel like in Orange County, where I'm at, in San Diego County, in LA County, we find CSAs pretty readily abundant. And so I just wanted to know your take on that. Would that be sort of a way to think about our own food systems?
And I think the more reliant you become on localized systems, the more resilient you'll become in terms of facing these pandemics. So like connected with various food producing places, I wasn't too worried about food. I was worried about maybe seasonality, what was available, right? But I think that the CSAs is a great model, but you always want to research your CSA to see if they have a good equity base. Whether they're paying their farmhands a lot, right? Because there's some like the Ecology Center in San Juan, and there's another one I think in San Diego County that's related to the connected to the Ecology Center, and they have a really good connection with their workers. So it is kind of gabachified, right? I mean, there's a lot of folks who are kind of the hippie runners, but they do pay their workers well, right? But there also are local farms. I actually help manage a 2-acre small farm in Santa Ana, and we try to work with local people, and we do it all. People who will harvest for free if they volunteer, and they can buy produce on the weekends, right? Once this pandemic is over, we'll see what happens. But there's also a group called Crece, which is a great resource for people in Santa Ana. And I think it's just getting connected to see what's out there. And I mean, honestly, the first step is just picking the fruits in your own backyard.
Wow, thank you so much, Moises. And I definitely feel you on the gabacho hippie thing that happens with that. So I'm going to be sharing my screen, and just so we can have lots of time for questions, I'm going to move fairly quickly, and I'm probably not going to go through all these slides, but we'll make sure that they're available for all the attendees afterwards. So again, thank you so much for staying on the call with us. My name is Jose Trinidad Castaneda. I live in Fullerton, and I'm the climate justice organizer with the Climate Action Campaign, which is the region's leading climate watchdog organization. And so we have one mission, which is to stop the climate crisis. And we have different strategies and goals on how we think we're going to get there, which is 100% clean energy, a world-class transit system, more trees, zero waste world, and we do all of this through a social equity lens. And so just to give you a feel for what some of the communities that are disproportionately impacted by environmental injustices look like, and where they are in Orange County and SoCal, a lot of environmentally disadvantaged communities are the communities that we all know and come from. Fullerton, Anaheim, Garden Grove, Santana. So we know where we need to invest in order to reach climate equity. But there's always these challenges, whether it's fossil fuel lobbyists or complacency, or even our own individual not engaging at the city level, lack of civic engagement. And so the first thing that we need to do to address the climate crisis is stop burning fossil fuels. This is very clear. It's backed by all the science in the world. You're not going to debate me on this. And so looking at Orange County, where are we still producing fossil fuels? Which companies are still involved in profit making based on extracting resources from the soil? And so we see that a lot of oil wells are still active in North Orange County and Huntington Beach. And so when we think about divestment as a term in the climate movement, we have to think about divestment of fossil fuels, divestment of our funds, company funds, university funds in these companies, in these IPOs. And so that's just a little taste. That's what we need to start off with, because if we don't stop burning fossil fuels, we'll never get ahead of the problem. We also know that rising seas will impact a huge number of people across the county. And so we need to think about how we use policy in a very responsible way to address rising seas. Over time, we know that communities are going to be harder hit, so we have the data for that. But what are some of the solutions that can come from this? Can we think about partnering with tribal communities, tribal leaders to use ecological solutions, environmentally friendly solutions, to build seawalls or mangroves or whatever it is that can help slow this sea level rise? And where is the money going to go? We need to understand how state legislation and state funding plays into how different programs help serve our communities. And so there's a bill called SB 535, which defines what a disadvantaged community is and how much funding they get from the state. And so please check it out, because as we talk about climate equity, we need to understand that there are cities that are at higher risk and least ready to adapt to climate changes ahead. And actually, according to, I think, the Washington Post, Santa Ana was rated as the highest risk and least prepared city in the entire United States to deal with climate change. And that has a lot to do with a history of inequity and disinvestment there. We also need to know which government agencies are at play. When we talk about policy, who are the people that enact those policies, that implement these policies that our elected officials and political leaders create? And so earlier on the call was just on the South Coast Air Quality Management District Youth Council, where we talk a lot about how we get the data and funding to communities and disadvantaged communities to clean up our air. And so different things are going to come up, but I'm not going to go through them in too much detail. Our cities can actually create climate action plans that can help us accelerate adaptations to climate changes ahead. We have a path towards 100% clean energy, which is called community choice energy. It's essentially democratizing our energy system, so we don't have a monopoly like SoCal Edison that sets the rates for us anymore. And instead, we the people can decide what energy mix we get, so cleaner energy and lower rates, lower costs for that. We also need to think about a world-class transit system in Orange County. It's safe to say we don't have one, but where do we build these transit systems? Where do we build rapid bus transit like what we enjoy in LA County? And it's where people live and where people work. So just to open up that conversation for you all as we talk about and think about policy and how it relates to climate action. And this is just, as a fellow vegan, I'm just very proud to share that US retail sales of plant-based food are now worth $5 billion over the past 5 years. So we know that plant-based food is an industry that is going to continue to grow, because these are not just flashes of consumer, consumer moments. These are long-term trends where younger people are choosing to buy more environmentally friendly products, packaging, etc. And the plant-based food section grew 5 times faster than all food sections. So when you go to the grocery store, I know you're looking at the refrigerated aisle section for your oat milk or for your oat milk yogurt products. So keep that going. So this is just a wish list of different policies that we can look at: building electrification, more bike lanes, more electric buses, urban forests. So these are the things that we need to continue to talk about, but I want to open up for questions, and just remember that it's time for choice. It's time for us to choose a cleaner world, a safer world, and one that's not riddled with future pandemics caused by ancient and paleological diseases, bacteria, viruses, you name it, that were previously frozen in the Arctic permafrost layer and now are just being released into the air. We're not tracking it at all. So on a final note, you can follow me on social media. I'm at Jose T. Castaneda 3 on almost all the platforms, and happy to answer further questions. So take it away. Oops, stop sharing.
I am gonna make a quick comment on that, and there are some questions here that I want us to tackle, but here's one important idea. These solutions and these ideas may seem like so like a lot to process, right? Or maybe if you're not familiar with some of these solutions, it may sound like this aloof plan, right? Because once we've lived in a certain way for so long, it is so hard for us to look beyond it, right? But we must, and let me tell you that these are true, like time-tested solutions, tested by our ancestors, indigenous communities. Like Moises is citing, like agricultural practices that are thousands of years old, right, and extremely productive and sustainable. I mean, we have solutions, and in those solutions, sorry, Trine, I'm gonna talk about 2 things in regards to that. I know we're talking a lot about plant-based diet, organic, veganism. Certainly, having an increase like plant-based in your diet will improve your well-being and the planet's health well-being, yes? But let's recognize the elitist approach. Like, it is elitist to imagine that the world can eat, or everyone in the world can afford organic as it is right now. The government is not subsidizing organic companies, right? They're subsidizing industrial ag, which makes it really expensive. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, we can't carry the entire responsibility on our backs, on the backs of individuals that are already overburdened. We must realize that not everyone has the same array of choices. And that's why good governance is so important. Yes, it is so important that we are politically active, because good governance is going to be what determines how heavy that load is on the backs of the most vulnerable.
Definitely, and thank you for raising that, because I don't want to reify kind of elitist ways of consuming. Definitely, as we know, a lot of plant-based products are sold at a premium, and not everyone has access to that, let alone via price or in terms of like where it's located in their communities, if it's distributed there at all. And, I just feel like I've forgotten to share so many things because I wanted to keep mindful of our time. But if you have the chance to learn about growing your own food or participating in a community-led agriculture space because you live in an apartment or a condominium and you don't have access to that land, do it. We have no other option. Actually, we just don't have the option of waiting around anymore. This is the time that we need to take advantage of to plant those seeds, to seed save, and to continue growing. And just in terms of equity, you know, I have felt it as a young person, as a person of color, queer person, indigenous person, you name it. All the identities that I have, I've felt the brunt of our oppressive systems, and I've chosen to share these solutions because these solutions act, these policies act at a systemic level, and not just one where we are, you know, we're composting, which is great, or we're eating more plant-based foods. It's actually one that is going to dramatically decrease greenhouse gas emissions at the fastest rate that we could possibly make it. And so thank you for that, because just one last story I'll share. The first time that I really felt that I knew I needed to get involved in policy was when I had a meeting with our then mayor, Bruce Whitaker in Fullerton, who I asked, like, hey, so can we put some solar panels on, you know, the parking lots in City Hall? Like, what are some easy things that we can do to get some more clean energy? Because I'm very worried about the fate of our world and extinction. And he responded that, oh no, we don't need solar panels. Those are too expensive. They're not really that clean. And oil is going to continue to be the way we go for a long time. Actually, I'm a very big champion of clean natural gas. And so when he said that, I thought, wow, like, he doesn't care if I live or die. And he's continued to prove it time and time again, even recently during this COVID crisis, where he's denied an eviction moratorium, where he's denied mandating masks for employees to wear at the stores, our grocery stores. So again, like, it makes me feel some type of way, because we need to continue these conversations at a policy level and unite around policies. But at the same time, young people on this call, we need to step up. Like, don't count on the government to solve this. Like, we need to become the next iteration of our government, one that's ecologically sensible, that's anti-capitalist, and continues to, you know, protect our lives.
Yeah, and I guess just sort of like piggybacking off of that, really emphasizing this idea of sovereignty and autonomy. And I know there are a lot of questions about green capitalism, and I feel like, just speaking on behalf of myself, I get very overwhelmed when I like engage in these conversations about these bigger systems like politics and capitalism. And I think that a good way of reclaiming and sort of finding your own solution is really stepping back and reclaiming our ancestral ways and like polishing those skills. Because if there's anything that we should have learned from this COVID crisis, it's that most of us are not prepared for a disaster. And I think that this is just sort of like, you know, not to be super doomsday, but this is sort of like a teaser of what's to really come, because this is a, you know, a sort of health crisis, a pandemic, but we have like an existential, catastrophic ecological collapse. That's the real issue. That's been the real issue. So I think that if one of the biggest conversations that we have to engage in, because like I said, we're past the conversation of conservation and is climate change real or not, like we're way past that. We have to start engaging in a conversation about resiliency and autonomy and polishing our ability to grow food, our ability to be disaster prepared, and you know, really sort of honing in on these skills, because right now we're in a position where most of us are still, or some of us, are still sort of privileged to where we still have access to water and food and all of these things. The shortages that we're coming across right now, we've created ourselves, you know, which is a whole other like privileged component to it. So that's not going to be the case in the future. Not to be super grim or whatever, but I think that in the overwhelming scheme of it all, a good way of just sort of like finding your peace and finding where you can hold yourself accountable, it's in polishing those skills and really preparing yourself for, you know, more disasters to come. Not to be super creepy or anything, but it's the reality. And ecological collapse is a serious thing. Extinction is a serious thing. And if we're gonna talk about the past 50 years, you know, that we've been celebrating Earth Day, there's still, hopefully there's still another 50 years to come. And if that's the case, I mean, this pandemic happened for a reason. This is a moment to be reflective, and let's reconsider our values, I guess.
And just to chime in a little bit, like there are places that, I mean, like just grow some tomatoes, grow some veggies, and see how it affects your bank account, right? I mean, not to put into that economic sense because you don't want to, but we do have to transition out of it, right? So just like always when I would start to negotiate and talk with people about why grow their own stuff, I would grow and like pick enough food for a salad and be like, hey, you know what? This salad is organically grown local. If you were to go to a market, this would cost you 12, 15 bucks. But since you're getting it here, it's free, right? Just growing your own stuff is a way of kind of like, to borrow Ron Finley, printing your own money, right? But it's not about the environment. It's not about the environment. It's not about the economy. It's about the environment. And like areas like in Chiapas, if you ever heard of the Zapatistas, I was down there a few years ago, and their lands, honestly, one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen is to see hillsides full of corn, beans, and squash, right? Where I know that the Zapatistas and the revolution that they had created to combat the economic systems that were putting in place in 1994 have survived up until recently, right? And they are still surviving right now and being resilient and providing a glimmer of what can be what is a hopeful situation for a very dark time period, right? Of growing and living in an autonomous way, right? So that's kind of piggyback off of you, Art, because there's a lot of doom and gloom, but there's things, right? And just to quote one of my favorite authors, Antonio Gramsci, right? My intellect makes me a pessimist, but my will make me an optimist, right? So always good things to think about.
And just I guess a closing thought to our panel as we move into the Q&A that Amber is going to facilitate. You know, it is a moment to seize. Yes, 50 years of Earth Day, and the question: will we be celebrating? Yes, will we be fighting? Right, 50 years from now, and there is no societal change without individual transformation. It is time to look in, transform, to mutate into a grander version of ourselves, right? So that we can collectively look forward.
Great, thanks, Eleni. So I'm going to try to combine some of the questions because there are definitely some themes that are coming up here. And one that I would like to maybe have us have the panelists address a little bit more directly, and that is on this idea of green capitalism, on the fetishization of sustainability, and how really through these like neoliberal models, co-optation is very popular, right? So to take an idea that comes from grassroots or comes from our communities and then really to monetize it. And so there's a couple of questions around like, what are our critiques of that? What are our responses really to what folks would call green capitalism or even ecofascism?
So I'll take I mean, there was a lot of parts to that question because it's combined. So I'll address a little bit about green capitalism because I know that Sarah Grant has asked a question on something like, you know, how do these companies like Beyond Meat exist outside of a capitalist framework, and are they green capital? Is it an example of green capitalism? And I think what we need to remember is that when it comes down to food, real food, right, that comes from farms, we need to think about how these have existed for thousands of years, millennia, and we hope that they continue to exist because that's how we feed ourselves as a species. We want to move towards a more regenerative, resilient economic model. And I think companies that use plants as their main source of whatever product they're selling, right? Beyond Meat uses pea protein, and not many people know that peas are one of the most critical garden plants that actually nitrify, that fix nitrogen to our soil. So they regenerate the soil. And if you consider what capitalism is, which is extractive, then that's not what Beyond Meat is, because they focus on sourcing their products with pea protein in the Central Valley, which is fixing nitrogen, pulling NO2 out of the air and putting it into the soil, which is regenerating the land. That's not green capitalism. That's a regenerative economy or economic business there.
Right, which is 100% true and 100% fair, but I think there also is the whole dimension when we're talking about green capitalism, how on a, I guess, environmentally sustainable aspect, yes, I'm extremely glad that they're putting nitrogen into the soil because our soil is very much depleted from that. But I think in a realistic standpoint, it is still like twice the price of regular meat. But I think Trini, you know, because we've worked on this together, that politically speaking, advocating for massive transition towards veganic agriculture, because the only reason that the real beef is more expensive than the artificial beef is because of government subsidies and where all of our money is going towards. So we have to really put pressure on our politicians and the people in power to start transitioning towards a more just and plant-based system where eventually, the plant-based options aren't going to be as expensive. They will be the new normal, So I think that on like a more realistic economic standpoint, we have to start holding our politicians accountable and really start advocating for a transition towards veganic agriculture, especially in California, where our entire, Central Valley is covered in CAFOs, is extremely polluted, and it's low-income people of color living in those areas. So we definitely have to put pressure on switching over, start subsidizing more pea protein, get more pea in the soil. Let's make that the new normal, not whatever it is that we have existing today.
Yeah, and exactly. Oh my gosh, talking with Audrey is so amazing, everyone. Just get to know her, follow her on social media. And not to distract from like what the intent of the question was, which is to really critique green capitalism. And when I think about green capitalism, what's currently happening, I think about SoCal Gas and Sempra, these utility companies that are marketing the sale of biodigesters and methane gas as clean gas that they can burn, that is not as destructive as the fossil fuels that they're extracting from the ground. And of course, we know that you can't make that that methane biofuel in mass, and you can't capture all that without having a very destructive animal agricultural system in the first place. So when I think about that, that's the greenwashing that we want to get rid of and we want to critique heavily. But when we think about Beyond Meat, because of the elitist premium prices, let's also think about like compare it apples to apples and not apples to fossil fuels. So
I'm gonna just add to that too, and put a grain of salt in all of this, okay? Just because grains of salt, are important, okay? And that is, as we transition into new forms of energy, for example, green energy, these lithium-ion batteries, I want to remind us that those have inputs, and that those inputs are coming from the same economic system that perpetuates pollution and enslavement of peoples, right? So yeah, green energy, and now we have like the new blood diamond is the stuff inside my electronic right now. So, Sarah, I do appreciate the grain of salt that you bring up, because I think every single one of us needs to be aware, and we don't have perfect solutions. What we have is a lot of trials. And when we make these trials, we can absolutely never accept the exploitation of human beings and the destruction, right? The annihilation of our regenerative systems, because then we go back to the same problem we started with.
Yeah, and I think that's a good connection to a question we have from Jennifer Pena, and a slight variation from other folks as well, which is what can we do to protect the workers that are being used as disposable in a variety of industries right now in this particular moment, and then also prior to the moment that we're in.
Can I go? At the bare minimum, pay them a working wage and give them the resources that they need in order to make it alive from a day-to-day basis. I think, I don't know, I've felt, personally speaking, sort of iffy on the dialogue lately during the pandemic, because there's almost like this fetishization of people who are working right now, like, oh, you know, like they really are just doing it for us. And it's not like, that's not necessarily the case. They don't have any other choice. And people who are marginalized don't, like, they need to survive, and they have to show up to work, whether they like it or not, even in the midst of a global pandemic. So I think we have to start, as much as things have slowed down during this pandemic, I've had this conversation with Alini. I think that a lot of things, like including schools and a lot of institutions, are still operating very corporate-y. So we have to like really, really try to retract from capitalism ringing in everybody's ears.
Just to comment a little bit, there are funds that you can donate to. There's one, I think, in Costa Mesa through a reverend that I will, if anyone's interested, I can supply more information about this. Where there's funds that are supporting folks who are giving people who need to take a time off, right? If they do get sick with the virus, giving them funds to give them some type of income, right? And just make sure, I'll make sure that they are credible sources, right? It's always important to make sure we don't feed into people who are taking advantage of the situation. But yeah, there are people who are actually trying to support local groups. I know that Building Healthy Communities, which is like a 10-year long initiative, it does a lot of support for farmers, right? So yeah, I hope that could be some type of solution.
Yeah, and I would just add that, you know, I see so many folks working towards finding alternatives. So mutual aid projects, I've been seeing quite a lot of. And I think one other way we can protect workers is to support them when they strike, when they ask us to boycott, to do that. You know, there's a lot of ways that we spend our money, sometimes without knowing, right, whose pockets we're lining. So I think it's really important to, and there's an app that actually Professor Abdelhak shared with me about finding current strikes and boycotts, and the ways you can participate and like not participate. And really just showing up for workers when they need support, because it's one thing to say I'm sending prayers to workers and I support them, but to really stand by them when they take a stand and where they're asking for work agreements and for unionization and things like that.
What is it? Vote with your dollar.
All right, should we do one more question and then we can close out? And I think maybe going back to, and there's quite a few questions. So if we don't answer it here, we'll give other opportunities for engaging in these types of conversations at the end as well. And take our classes, that's also a good way. But this question comes from Nicole Viegas. She asked one of the first questions, which is, what are your thoughts that we see the environmental benefits as a result of the global slowdown? And I know, Alini, you just recently posted those maps and charts about like how we see these big changes in large urban areas. And so in terms of less pollution, lowering the carbon footprint, does this show that the world needed to take a break from everyday activity?
I don't know that we needed like a pandemic to remind us of the ills that we are causing. But, you know, in terms of what do those maps and charts of the clearing skies tell us, I'll tell you what I think. I think it tells us that we have an opportunity to heal, and we can engage in that healing process and think about when we go out there, are we going to do the same thing and gray up our skies or again, or are we going to dare to keep the skies blue, right? It's an opportunity, and that's how I see that.
And from the food standpoint, I've always talked with a lot of my farm folks, and we say, hey, you know, we just have to wait for climate change to get so severe that it's going to demand local urban ag to be considered as a logical, reasonable way of doing things. But do you really want to get there? Kind of what, to piggyback off what Audrey said, you know, this is like a little sample of what is going to happen, right? And as a sample, maybe this is growing some compassion in all of us to literally just plant a seed, right? Plant in any seed that grows food, right? And to, because that is kind of like the basis of transforming your existence. And not to say that I think policy is essential, as going out and talking with your representatives, finding out who your representatives are, right? Talking to your city council, having them advocate for your needs and demand what you want, right? There's a great quote by Frederick Douglass, right? Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will, right? So we do need to demand those changes, and I mean demand them.
I think that this moment, we didn't ask for this moment, but it's already here, and we had to use this as an opportunity to really adapt the language that we use, the rhetoric that we use, and tie COVID-19 with the climate crisis, because we want to continue having clean air. I mean, we already know that people in air with more air pollution in their neighborhoods face a disproportionate, you know what I mean, an impact from COVID-19. So we want to continue cleaning up the air, building a better world. But I think it starts with a moment of self-reflection and really using the time to think deeply, what is my role in all this? What legacy will I choose, not just for myself, but for the next 7 generations to come? Because we are on borrowed time. We are not on, we are born, we die. We're borrowing time on this earth from the next 7 generations. And I think we need to start with that. And from a policy perspective, Moises is absolutely correct. You need to get civically engaged, email your council members, your elected officials, build a relationship, not just with them as elected officials, but within your community as well. You can find multiple organizations like the Sierra Club, or even my organization that already has ways to get involved. It's just up to you to sign up and start communicating as well.
Great. All right. Well, I just want to thank all of our attendees for joining. I'm going to go ahead and close us out. So what I'm going to share is a bit of a summary and also a call to action and an exercise to envision where we go from here. So I just want to offer thanks and gratitude to all the panelists who shared their wisdom, their hearts. I am awakened and inspired, so thank you all so much. And I especially want to thank Alini for wrangling us and getting us all together. This has been an amazing experience, so thank you. So this Earth Day, I find myself grappling with many fundamental questions. What are the dominant illusions that exist? What is our present reality? What truths has this biopolitical pandemic exposed? We live in a settler society that values profit for a small number of humans at the expense of all other living beings. Insatiable corporate greed, toxic individualism, punishment, violence, denial are all attributes of the status quo. Resources are not scarce, they are hoarded and held captive. We know that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are disproportionately affected by the pandemic. We see the blatant political manipulation of racist rhetoric and the weaponization of fear that incites violence towards our Asian relatives. We see the pathologization of Black and Latinx folks, people living with chronic illness, and people with disabilities. The pandemic poses a grave health threat to Indigenous peoples around the world. We know that pervasive marginalization and deprivation was created long before, but is exacerbated by this pandemic. Human caging, family separation, childhood sexual abuse, gender-based violence, segregation and lack of affordable housing, immense wealth inequality, medical discrimination, health disparities, environmental degradation, climate change, eco-fascism and green capitalism, the belief that certain humans and other than humans are disposable. They are not. We are not. Racism is the pre-existing condition. This is a haunting fact. This is a moment to take pause and ask yourself, how have these dominant ideologies and practices seeped into my pores, calcified in my bones, polluted my everyday life and relationships? Finally, a truth that has been laid bare is the fact that we cannot rely on a settler colonial state and its institutions to care for us. We never could. What creates crisis cannot solve it. Red Nations, Red Deal teaches us that colonialism and capitalism must be overturned for this planet to be habitable, for human and non-human relatives to live dignified lives. The Red Deal platform calls on us all to build a new world, much like what our panelists have done today. Demilitarization, police and prison abolition, abolishing ICE, tearing down border walls, Indigenous liberation, decolonization, land restoration, treaty rights, free healthcare, free education, housing, full citizenship, equal protection for undocumented relatives, a complete moratorium on oil, gas, coal, and carbon extractive and emissions, a transition to an economy that benefits everyone and that ends exploitation of the global South and Indigenous nations for resources, safe and free public transportation, restoration of Indigenous agriculture, food sovereignty, restoration of watersheds and waterways, denuclearization, Black self-determination and autonomy, gender and sexual equality, two-spirit, trans, and queer liberation, and the restoration of sacred sites. We are living in a moment that beseeches us to reflect on what we will no longer tolerate, what we must discard, and to identify what we yearn for. We must step into our power and create something else. But first, we must imagine. Gloria Anzaldúa said, awareness of our situation must come before interchanges, which in turn come before changes in society. Nothing happens in the real world unless it first happens in the images in our heads. I call upon us all to dream a new reality. Arundhati Roy reminds us that another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. What do you dream of? I'm going to ask a series of questions, and I want you to visualize with your mind's eye your answer to each question. Notice what happens in your body. So if everybody, thank you for those who are still with us. If you can inhale and exhale. And if you're able, if you'd like to close your eyes and keep breathing. What has this pandemic awakened in you? Fear, anger, rage, anxiety, love, grief, joy, connection, compassion. Sit with them, notice them, engage them all. These are your relatives. What beliefs and practices do you need to disconnect from, shift away from, transform? How are you bound by these systems? What are you holding on to? What would it take to break away, to let go? What are the ideas, beliefs, and ways of beings that will propel us forward? What is required of me, of us? What practices will sustain us and ensure our survival? What needs to be healed in you, in your family, in your community? Mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, intergenerational, holy. What would it take? Where do you draw power and strength from? Who are you called to be? What kind of ancestor will you be? Deepa Iyer reminds us that we need everyone. Weavers, experimenters, frontline responders, visionaries, builders, caregivers, disruptors, healers, storytellers, and guides. We exist in a moment that calls on us to dream, to envision new relationships, new systems, new worlds. Breathe. Breathe and remember. Remember our original instructions. We are medicine. Come back to yourself. Open your eyes and keep dreaming. Ideate, calibrate. Practice hope amidst despair. Listen to your dreams, to your intuition, to your abuelas. Care for others. Seek pleasure. Build trust. Nurture beloved communities. Protect the land, water, air, each other. Look back to look forward. Call on your ancestors for guidance. Let's burn brighter and move towards this world every day. The work did not begin with us, and it most certainly will not end with us. Thank you.
I just want to join in thanking everybody, following up. Thank you, Amber. And we look forward to seeing you in physical space. But for now, we're going to continue the conversations in the virtual space. So I'll be following up virtual, via email with another invitation for a student version of this conversation where we're gathering some of the FC student leaders to, ask the same question: what are the visions forward, and hear how the students will answer that. We'll try to follow up with a lot of your questions too via email. And all in all, let's continue the movement that started, not just 50 years ago, but with our ancestors. Let's, like Amber said, look back to look forward. Thank you, everybody. We'll end here. Okay, bye.